Okay, so this talk was originally given before a live studio audience as part of Unley's U Connect, where we go to St. John's Lutheran Church and run a little bit of a church service for youth people. This is the talk we did, but a little bit different because obviously there's not a crowd to bounce ideas off of. Let's get started. We're going to play a game of Guess Who. Alright? Good game. I love the game. So, I want to put up a quote. You have to tell me who it is that I am referring to. My family is dead, so I fight people. You could be thinking of basically any action hero that you can think of, any assassin, any form of media, so we'll just attribute the quote to everyone. Here's a few people that you might be thinking of when I said, my family is dead, so I fight people. The first time you encounter this dark and edgy assassin character, or this rough badass, it's super profound. You're like, whoa, this person's awesome. But then you realize it's like the main backstory for a lot of these people, and so it just sort of loses its power, right? It's not as intense. You just sort of glaze your eyes over like, oh yeah, it's another dark and tragic past. And I think we can translate the same principle to the next round of Guess Who, which is that musical with upbeat music but dark lyrics. Because, we could be referring to anything like, Heathers, Repo the Genetic Opera, Little Shop of Horrors. If we're thinking about, just specific songs and musicals, we then open that up to Sincerely Me from Dear Reverend Hanson, Cell Block Tango from Chicago, Master of the House from Les Mis, that one song in the Book of Mormon that I'm not going to say its name, and basically anything by King George. Now, the first time you hear that song or that music with super intense lyrics but upbeat music, you're like, whoa, this is profound. This is something new. So for me, personally, my first encounter of the dark lyrics with upbeat music was by My Chemical Romance. It was the song Blood, the hidden track on the Black Parade, where someone is singing about all the blood that the doctors and nurses are taking from them, but it's like played on a honky-tonk piano. To me, that blew my mind. Like, wow, how can you have lyrics that are so dark and humorous, but have the tune and the lyrics and the music sounding upbeat, and just that contrast was super profound for me. That's kind of why when the Heathers musical came out, my eyes just sort of glazed over, because I remember the 1980s Heathers, which was, a clever deconstruction of the genre, and, no writer was in it, which is just always a positive. But you kind of had this idea of the 80s, like, John Hughes movie styling, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, Breakfast Club. It took that aesthetic, but made it super dark, and that was profound. Whereas, for me, the dark and edgy musical was just another thing. I kind of glazed over it. Like, my eyes didn't care. I just was like, yeah, why would you ruin something so unique? Also worth noting, I did miss a con on this list. Riverdale, covering Heathers, was like another con that we sort of talked about. I wanted to flag that, yes, I acknowledge that the Riverdale incarnation of Heathers was garbage. But the other thing is, this sort of repetitive, something that's profound and becomes mundane, can be translated to something that I know a lot of us may have encountered, which is the Christian guest speaker. I don't know about you, but there are like 3 kinds of testimony that I've ever heard somebody give when they're guest speaking at a church. The first is, "Hi, I'm Brad. I used to kill kittens and do drugs, but then I had a divine revelation." And then they go on about how God transformed their life. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. The first time you hear it, like, whoa, that's awesome. But again, when you hear it enough, it kind of loses its impact. The second kind of testimony is the, "Hi, I'm Brad, and I grew up in a good Christian household, but I never really understood my faith until I had a divine revelation." That's kind of the second type, and it's still got the divine revelation, which is the, whoa, that's awesome. But again, you hear it all the time, and you got sort of zone out to it. You're like, yeah, whatever, I get where you're going with this. The third kind is what I call the all of the above, which is the, "Hey, I'm Brad, and I went in a usual..." It's like, the third one is the, "Hi, I'm Brad, and I grew up in, good Christian family. Then I started doing drugs and killing kittens. And then I had a divine revelation." And, that's all you have. And, again, the first time you hear it, boom, super impactful. And then you start, zoning out to them. And that's because All of those same things, super edgy assassin backstory, super edgy musical, super edgy display of God's divine power, you become desensitized to them. Because people want to tell stories because they sound profound, but the more you hear about them, the less impactful they become. And part of the reason we do desensitize ourselves to them is it's hard to relate to them. Like, everyone in the room under 25. Like, no one can really relate to those awesome experiences yet. And so it's just kind of like, oh, another guy's talking about some super awesome thing that happened in their life. All right. Like, there's no really a relation. And it can sometimes feel really lonely not having the divine intervention, obvious, big explosion, extravagant, life-changing event. So where can we find the mundane testimony or find hope in the mundanity of not getting that? And this is where the book of Esther comes in. Alright, the book of Esther in the Bible is the only book to not mention God once. As in, he's just not there, not mentioned at all. And yet, this particular story is still significant enough to the overall arc of God's plan that it's still worth including. The only real, the key figure in the story is Esther, who's just a regular Jewish woman who is, incredibly attractive. Maybe not as easy to relate to as it sounded when I was starting that, but she doesn't get the divine revelation. She just stumbles backwards through life and ends up in the right place at the right time to do what needs to be done. Alright? The entire book of Esther is about that. So we start off with King Xerxes is like, I'm not really super stoked on my queen right now, so I'm gonna find a new one. So he sends out his guards, collects all of the most attractive women that they can find, including Esther. It's like when the king's guards tell you to get in the van, you get in the van. So she does that, hops in, ends up winning this beauty contest, and so boom, she's the new queen. But there was no God's voice telling her, be here so this will happen, or you will be the queen. It's literally, she just stumbled backwards into it. And then her uncle Mordecai overhears a couple of guys planning an assassination attempt on the king, and he's like, how convenient that my niece is the queen. So he tells her, she warns him, and assassination attempt stopped, and now look, the king is like, hey, I'm super stoked on my queen, she saved my life, what the hell, that's awesome. And, again, no divine revelation, just someone happened to be there at the right time, happened to send that to Esther, happened to send that to the king. This becomes super important because then Haman, who's one of the advisors to the king, is like, hey, these Jewish people are kind of problematic, not super keen on them, I reckon we should wipe them all out. And the king's like, yeah, whatever, doesn't bother me, sure, my advisor thinks this is a good move, I'll go for it. But because Esther is Jewish and is queen, she's now in a position to do something about that. And in doing that, she's able to then, make sure God's promise to Abraham and to David comes true, in that the family line continues for Jesus to be born down the line. But nowhere in this story do we explicitly see a big extravagant display of God's power. It's literally just people being in the right place at the right time. So, let's look at it here. Here's the Star Trek timeline. Just ignore the bit that branches off. But in our lives right now, a lot of people watching this, you're going to be very much in that first, 10%, 20% area, right? That means you're still, being defined, figuring out where you're at in life, figuring out who you are. But God's still with you in that time and is lining you up to be where you need to be, right? You don't need to have a big dramatic origin story to have your life being intentionally shifted to the right spot. And even if there is a big divine moment, I brought up Huntress earlier, or at least brought up the Mary Elizabeth Winstead incarnation of Huntress earlier. She has the my family are dead so I fight people arc. But even after that big divine extravagant backstory, she becomes a high school teacher. Because the mundanity of life is unavoidable, right? Having a big divine moment doesn't suddenly change who you are. It's not like your life is constantly divine moments. It will be impactful and it can show you God's power, but there's more to that in life, right? God's with you even in the mundane parts. And I'm going to turn us to the 2 things that you can tell your parents when they ask you, hey, what happened at youth today? Because your parents are going to ask that, because they always ask that. So the first point that you can repeat when asked: extravagant displays of divinity are modern day examples of God's power, right? Just because someone gives their super awesome testimony that you've heard a billion times from different people, in a way, it doesn't make them any less powerful, right? God's still at work in that divine way. It's just hard to relate to, and so we can become desensitized to it. But it's important for us to not get completely desensitized to them. It's important for us to recognize they are still legitimate faith experiences that have shown God's power and impacted that person's life, and they are still worth sharing. Even though they might be hard to relate to, it's worth talking about God's power, right? The second thing is God is still moving intentionally through those downtimes. Quietly being there is still being there. I don't know if you guys watch Australian Survivor at all. I mentioned Australian Survivor instead of US Survivor because in Australian Survivor, there's a history of winners winning because they don't be super extravagant and extra. They quietly navigate their way through, but they are still exactly where they need to be, and the game has gone exactly how they need to go for them to win. And that's kind of like how I was thinking about God. He is always there, and he is always with you, guiding you, protecting you. He just doesn't need to be super explosive about it. Sometimes he will be, but just because you haven't had that epic, explosive moment in your backstory, it doesn't mean that God's not there with you. God gives us hope in the mundanity and the slowness of life because he's intentional about being there with us, no matter what. And we don't have to worry that our faith journey is different to someone else's faith journey. That doesn't invalidate either of our faith journeys. And it's important to know that your faith journey is yours and God is with you, however that looks.